All right, so the past few weeks we've been going pretty fast through the Old Testament and sometimes covering like 4 or 5 books of the Bible in one night. So I felt kind of like a steam engine kind of barreling along. And even though we are doing a good overview, sometimes we'll kind of pause and take a little closer look to kind of zoom in on some books or some events. So as we put together our big Bible overview, we can talk about these events with a better understanding of the context. And so that's what I want to do tonight, is to kind of zoom in on one of the events that we kind of pushed on through really fast last week, when we had talked about the book of Deuteronomy being the foundation, the moral, spiritual foundation, and the guide for the history books that follow through the period of the Judges and the period of the Kings. So we're going to look at one of the stories in the period of the Judges tonight. It is the Conquest of Canaan, when Joshua was the leader of the people and was followed Moses' instructions that he laid out in Deuteronomy. So we're going to read those. And these are the passages we're going to read in order. We'll start in Deuteronomy 20, and then chapter 7, and then Joshua 6 and 11. So we'll read the instructions in Deuteronomy, and then an example of how those played out in the book of Joshua. And since we're not going to be barreling through kind of 5 books of the Bible in one evening, if you do have a question, we've got a little more time tonight, so do raise a hand as we think about this, because I'll tell you what we're talking about tonight. It's going to raise some tough questions that are so tricky, we probably won't come up with every single answer in one night. We'll be thinking about this, and this will be good food for thought for a while. So we've got time to ask as many questions as we think of, because we're not going to stress out about finding all the answers to life's questions, but we want to study this story and think about what it means, what it meant then, what it means for today. So I'm going to pass out a handout. While I do so, let me play a little music as a background. This can be our musical background for the passing of the handouts here. And I think you will recognize the song.
Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down.
Feel free to snap.
You may talk about your men of Gideon, you may talk about your men of Saul, but there's none like good old Joshua at the battle of Jericho.
Everybody.
Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. Right up to the walls of Jericho, they marched with spear in hand. Go blue and red horns, Joshua cried, 'cause the battle is in my hand. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. Then the lamb ran sheep horns began to blow, and the trumpets began to sound. Joshua told those children to shout that morning, and the walls came tumbling down. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho.
All right, that's good. Okay, just sing the chorus once more. And we've heard the chorus before, so I'll go ahead and stop it there. A fun song that most kids who enter a church at some point hear the song and learn the song. So the words were on the right half, and on the left, you'll see a map of the Israelites' entrance into the promised land of Canaan. And I didn't know, sometimes in Bibles, some might have maps, some have lots of maps at different times and different eras. So I just want to make sure that everybody had a map of the Israelites entering Canaan. They had wandered in the desert for 40 years as a punishment for rebelling against God and Moses. And we read that, how God said, because of your rebellion, none of this generation will enter the promised land. So they had to wander 40 years. And then following the thick arrow on the right, they then, some tribes stayed on the east side of the Jordan, but then most of them crossed the Jordan and then kind of spread out. So there's kind of a map to keep as a reference. So first we're going to read and talk about Deuteronomy chapter 20. And in my Bible, the chapters and the sections have different headings that kind of explain what will be talked about in that section. And the heading in my Bible for Deuteronomy chapter 20 is going to war. And these are instructions that Moses gave to the people before he dies to prepare them to then enter the land of Canaan and what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it. So let me read the first 4 verses of Deuteronomy chapter 20. This is Moses speaking to the Israelites on the verge of the promised land. When you go to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army greater than yours, do not be afraid of them, because the Lord your God, who brought you up out of Egypt, will be with you. When you are about to go into battle, the priest shall come forward and address the army. The priest shall say, "Hear, O Israel, today you are going into battle against your enemies. Do not be faint-hearted or afraid. Do not be terrified or give way to panic before them. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you victory." So that would be a reassuring message to hear for the people at this time, to hear the message, do not be afraid of stronger forces, because the Lord your God will be with you. That's verse 1 said that. And then the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you victory. That was in verse 4. So a very encouraging message for them to hear. Hopefully they would have felt that strength and encouragement. But first let's back up a little bit and talk about who they will be fighting and why they will be fighting those people. And you'll see in the map, this was the land of Canaan. And so there were people living there for a few hundred years. And there were towns and cities of different tribes. And in a minute, we'll read verses that list a lot of those different tribes, the Jebusites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and a lot of ites kind of tribes. There's a lot of people there living in the land. And as the Israelites left Egypt, wandered in the desert 40 years, then they received these orders to cross into the promised land and settle it and take over. So they'll be encountering these cities and towns and these people living here, and that's who they will be fighting. Those will be their enemies when they go to war. And even the title of that section, Going to War, when you go to war, that's the first thing that kind of raises some interesting questions for me. And I know this is an Old Testament world they're living in. This is before Jesus had come. But, we live in a resurrection world, in a New Testament world. So it does make me ask the question, the WWJD question, what would Jesus do about this instance for going to war? Any initial thoughts about that question, the WWJD question, and this endeavor that the Israelites are about to embark upon? I don't know. Just feels like, what would Jesus do? Invade other towns and cities? It's interesting to think about. It kind of raises some questions about behavior, since, what would Jesus do? He would turn the other cheek. That's what he said he would do. That's what he told us to do. And his very life was the utmost example of laying down and sacrificing his life for others. So that's what Jesus would have done. He would have turned the other cheek and wanted his followers to turn the other cheek. So that's the first kind of kind of thinking. And because of that, should there really be a section for God's followers called Going to War in our holy book? This is our holy book, our guide to living. Should there be a section called Going to War in our holy book? Any thoughts on that just yet? The questions are going to get trickier, so what do you think?
My section where they have the top tell you what's following is laws of warfare.
Laws of warfare.
And what God expected.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about that. In our holy book of godly living, there's a section, laws of warfare, going to war. How to attack a city where there's people living in it, minding their own business.
And not be afraid.
And to not be afraid.
Because God's with them.
Yes. Well, verse 4, and that's what verse 4 says, that God fights for them. That not only is God with them, which is good, but it says God fights for them against their enemies. And that raises another interesting question for me. Does God actively fight against people? And again, we don't have to come up with any answers because this raises interesting questions. Does God actively fight against people? I don't know if that's how I would put it. I don't know.
I think he somehow guides them.
Guides them, yeah.
And they're vigilant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the verses after these, in verses 5 through 9, it says that the officers are supposed to encourage the soldiers to resolve any unfinished business at home before they go to war and attack a town, just in case the soldier dies in battle. And the officer is supposed to say that, for example, they need to be sure to dedicate their house to the Lord for themselves, it says, so that someone else won't come in, take their house, and dedicate it for themselves, should that soldier die. And I guess that's good advice, kind of to call dibs on your house in case the worst should happen. But also, again, if Jesus was walking around the camp and preaching to the crowds there, as he often did in the New Testament, is that the priority that he might tell the men who might be going off into battle? Like, wait, men, there's one thing you need to do. Go claim your house and dedicate it so that nobody else can come in and dedicate it for you. It's just an interesting number one kind of priority for preparation. Well, let's keep reading. Let me read verses 10 through 14. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men in it. As for the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves, and you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. So, what are the two choices that a city that's about to be attacked has when the Israelites knock on the gate door? What are their two choices?
Make peace
Make peace
or attack.
or refuse peace. That's right. So if they decide to make peace, which sounds like, oh good, oh well, accept peace. What happens if they accept peace?
Forced labor.
That's right. Everyone is subject to forced labor. Peace is kind of in a, I don't know if I'd call that peace, but okay, so that's one option. Or if they refuse to accept peace, then it says all the men die while the women and children are taken as plunder. Okay, so those are their That's the town's two choices, which is kind of an odd choice to make, to be presented with. So what if you were born in one of those cities, and your family had lived there for a few hundred years, and you happened to be born there, and you were on gate duty, and you answered the door of the gate when the Israelites knocked, and they proposed those two choices. What would you choose?
The third option.
There's a third option? What's that?
Run.
Right, lock the gate even tighter, barricade, yes. Yeah, well, if they didn't accept the peace, it said to lay siege to the city. So I guess the Israelites would lay siege and just wait them out until they ran out of supplies or food. I would probably just kind of lock the doors, roll up the windows. Yeah. Well, let's read verse 15. What does verse 15 say? This is how you are to treat all the cities that are at a distance from you and do not belong to the nations nearby. Okay, so that's a good instruction. That instruction, that choice, that option of two not so great choices, those are for towns that are not directly inside the land that the Israelites will claim for themselves. These instructions are for towns that are more like the neighbors in the next area over, but better to be safe than sorry. We don't want the neighbors getting any idea, so we should either kill all of them or subject them to labor. So this is a choice for the neighboring cities, not in the lands that the Israelites will take. So now let's read what the Israelites are supposed to do to all the people who are living in the places that they intend to settle in. Let me read verses 16 through 17. However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. So, do not leave alive anything that breathes, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Is a pretty intense instruction. And that's a heavy instruction to receive. That would then involve a lot of violence, a lot of killing, a lot of death would then follow. And the reason for that heavy instruction is in verse 18. Otherwise, so if they don't do that, otherwise, those people will teach you to follow all the detestable things that they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. So what do you think about that reason? Does it make sense? That reason for killing every man, woman, and child who were living in a town that you wanted to take over, is that a pretty good reason?
Well, it seems really very, very severe from this perspective, but the people of Israel had been already in a foreign land themselves for generations. And so the fact that they retained their Israelite ways, if they did, and their identity is rather miraculous. And then it's almost as though this is about that. It's about clearing the path so that they can be a set apart people.
Yes.
And if that's what it takes, I guess, to get us to the Jesus point in time, then I could see that's a justification for it.
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, it's still hard to justify and understand, but that's the only sense I can make of it.
Yes, and that is the reason, whatever someone else or someone of us might think of it, that was the reason to preserve their Jewish identity. Back then, all through the Old Testament, the threat of people turning to other gods is the biggest threat to Israel in all the Old Testament. That it's a constant, it's a running theme. It was a running worry. People gave into that temptation all through the Old Testament. And we read some of those examples last week. We talked about the Deuteronomic history and how in Deuteronomy it says, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You should worship the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And no one should worship any other gods. And that's when we said that the books of Kings are examples of when the kings and the people did turn to worship other gods. And there was hundreds of years when most of Israel's kings, it says, did evil in the eyes of the Lord, because they kept being tempted to turn to these other gods. Apparently it was a huge temptation for the Israelites all through the Old Testament. It would have been a temptation if they wanted something that they didn't have. Like if they wanted better crops because their crops were failing or they weren't growing big enough, they wanted a bigger harvest. Or if it was about bearing children or having children, fertility, producing an heir, or if it was about protection or military victories or maintaining wealth, protecting yourself, whatever it was, if they wanted something that they didn't have yet, they would be tempted to think, well, my God, Yahweh, is not giving it to me, so I don't know, maybe I'll try praying to some of the neighbors' gods and see if they can bring the rain for the crops. That was the temptation, and unfortunately, a lot of the kings fell prey to that temptation, and a lot of the people did as well. That's why we said last week that the rules and the foundation of Deuteronomy set the standard for the history books that follow. Sometimes they met that standard and sometimes they didn't, and they were severely punished for it, going on and on. And when we talk about the exile in a few weeks, that's the big consequence. So that was the threat, that they would give into that temptation, lose their identity as a people group, as a religion, and give up on the covenant that God had established. We talked about that covenant a few weeks ago, how important it was. So, therefore, passages like Deuteronomy Chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, since this was such a big threat for the people, this temptation was so great. Let me read Deuteronomy Chapter 7, verse 1 through 6. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, the Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hibites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. And the Lord's anger will burn against you, and will quickly destroy you. This is what you are to do to them. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles, and burn their idols in the fire. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. So you can see that this threat, this temptation, really did threaten their whole identity. It threatened them keeping the covenant. And another way that temptation runs throughout the Old Testament is that intermarrying. And that is a really serious problem that they get punished for, because they will have people intermarry with the neighboring tribes who worship pagan idols. And so, when your wife goes to this other church, maybe you start going to that other church, or maybe you have kids and maybe you spend Christmas with them, or if, your wife is a Canaanite, or, whatever. You see that practice today in kind of different kinds of marriages. They might, even if it sounds strange to us, like, yes, we do Christmas with this family and then Hanukkah with this family. That happens today, and that's what they were worried about. They were worried about the people of God, Israel, intermarrying with the neighboring tribes and having that weaken their identity, their religion, their covenant. It threatened the very nature of their people because, like it said, they were a small people surrounded by bigger, stronger peoples and cities. And if it weren't for God being with them, they wouldn't have survived. And so if they were to do anything that nullified the covenant and cut them off from God's support, then they're out. They're going to lose if they fight anybody who's around them because they were weaker. Now, on the map, the land of Canaan, all those people and all those cities where you see the arrows of the Israelites invading, they've been living there for a few hundred years, and now the Israelites have arrived and they plan to conquer the land. So because the religions of the native groups were so tempting to the Israelites need to kill them all so that they wouldn't be tempted by them anymore. And it does make me wonder if there was anything the people already living there could have done to save their lives. Because I think how sad every man, woman, and child gets just kind of killed. Is there anything they could have done? And I don't know. It doesn't kind of give a third option. Like you can take this one, door number 1, door number 2. It doesn't say if there was a door number 3. I don't know. In my optimism, my naivete, I would hope that if I opened the gates as the Canaanite gatekeeper, and they said, "Hi, we're the Israelites. We come to kill all of you because your religion, we can't handle the temptation." Then I might say, "Oh, guess what? We're all Jews now. Hey, everybody, we're all Jews now because it's that or die." And everybody would be like, "Okay, great." Maybe so. I don't know. It doesn't. I don't think it mentions that any towns took a third kind of way, a third kind of option like that. But I would hope that there might have been some kind of hope. Because there was many examples of many cities, and that map shows many cities with many arrows going into it. And one of them, maybe the one that's more well known, is the city of Jericho, largely due to the song that everybody knows, the Battle of Jericho. We heard that earlier. So let's read what happened in Jericho after the walls came tumbling down. So let me read from Joshua chapter 6, verses 20 to 21. When the trumpet sounded, the people shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the people gave a loud shout, the wall of Jericho collapsed. So every man charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. So, wow, that's rough. That's intense. Not just men, women, and children, but the elderly, the animals, cattle, sheep, the poor donkeys who probably didn't know what was going on. But it does make it a little strange when we think about, we've got this fun, happy song that we teach to kids, and we all know it, and it's about complete bloodshed of men, women, children, and sheep. And that's not in the song. There's not another verse that says, "Oh, and by the way, they killed the sheep and the kids too." Right? We leave that out of the song because it wouldn't be as fun to sing. The song kind of stops the story at the end of verse 20. And we just don't mention that the children were killed, the cows and the donkeys were killed as well. And this didn't just happen at Jericho. Like on the map, there's lots of cities there. Joshua followed Moses' instructions in Deuteronomy all through the land of Canaan so that they could establish themselves as a people. So let me read Joshua 11, verses 18 through 20. Joshua waged war against all the kings for a long time, except for the Hibites living in Gebaon. Not one city made a treaty of peace with the Israelites, who took them all in battle. For it was the Lord himself who hardened their hearts to wage war against Israel, so that he might destroy them totally, exterminating them without mercy, as the Lord had commanded Moses. So, if I'm reading verse 20 right, it says God made those local kings refuse a peace treaty so that the Israelites could, it says, destroy them totally, exterminating them without mercy. That is heavy. That is a heavy verse to read and to think about. So what do we do with verses like that? Think about the way that you think about God now. We are resurrection people, we're Easter people, we live in a New Testament time and era. So think about the way that you think about God and what God wants of us and what the kingdom of heaven looks like that we believe God is working to build. If yesterday, before you knew that we were going to be reading the book of Joshua, if yesterday someone had asked you, would you say that God is fine with exterminating a people group without mercy? Or, based on Jesus' teaching, would you say that, if you've been asked yesterday, if you'd have said, oh, God is all about showing mercy. You know what I mean? What do you think? Well, if someone had asked you kind of a question yesterday, and you know we're going to read Joshua, and they'd say, does God ever not show mercy? Or God is God of mercy? Or what do you think? How would you have responded to that kind of question?
Well, God, number one, is sovereign.
Mm-hmm.
And he sees that he's the creator, he sees everything, backward, forward, immediate. And so there's a purpose for his actions. And
There are many things we don't know.
right.
Mm-hmm.
And he is our creator.
Mm-hmm.
So
there will be many things, because we don't know everything, that we're not going to maybe be able to come up with all the answers to explain everything in the universe and history. Yeah, sure.
It's still pretty harsh, exterminating without mercy. I mean,
That's tough.
Without,
Yeah.
And everything, not just the warrior or the army people.
Mm-hmm.
It's men, women, and sheep and
Yeah.
donkeys.
Yeah.
I'm sure the
Yeah.
dogs too.
The what ones too?
I said, I'm sure the little doggies too.
Oh, the little dogs. That's not the song. We're not going to teach kids that part of the song, but everything that breathes means everything. Yeah, Marshall.
The conquest of Canaan took place about 3,500 years ago.
Mhm.
It's hard for us to impose our understanding
Mhm.
on them.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Well said. Yeah, Bill.
Well, the Canaanites are not exactly the type of people you want as your next door neighbor. I mean, we have to realize that there was something about what they were and what they did,
Mm-hmm.
what their influence was, that was pure evil. I mean, if you read about when the Israelites got infected by some of this stuff, and they were sacrificing their own children to their gods in the Betha Valley or wherever it was. I mean, there was pure evil there. And I think in this process that the Lord was trying to set up a perfect people with a perfect law, knowing that it wasn't possible. And that's why we all needed a Savior. Because throughout the verses that you read, I mean, verse 18 out of Deuteronomy 20, I mean, that happened throughout the history of Israel. I mean, they failed that completely. And so
The threat was real.
the threat was real, and we may say, well, it was horrible to exterminate a whole line of people, and eventually, to go through the whole history, they never completely conquered the land.
Mm-hmm.
And they wound up leaving bits and pieces of influence, which did come through and permeate their society.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
it's it's harsh, but I mean, the people in that time were harsh.
Yeah. Everybody hear that in the back? Yeah.
I mean,
Heard
they
that
were
last
harsh.
part.
Yeah.
Yeah, what they did was harsh, and if you just go through all of these places, when you look at some of these, when you look at the Assyrians, when you look at, you go all the way through, these people were monsters, and so.
Not the kind of neighbors you'd ask for a cup of sugar.
Right.
Right.
Giant.
And even if you go into the New Testament time, you have the Romans, I mean, and what they did, so you're constantly surrounded by that, and then you get even beyond that, look at the Crusades and what they did, was just as bad,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't really have a dictate to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then you get into the 20th century and you get the reason that we went to World War II, which in my eyes is the modern version of pure evil. And so the question it causes me to think about is, has good and evil become so diluted in our modern 21st century culture that we would even recognize it enough to know we needed to try to eliminate it?
That's a good point.
Mm. That's well said.
Is there justification for war today?
A very good question. Especially thinking about, like June said, World War II and the pure evil and the suffering that was happening. Would that then, the question is posed, be a justification to go even into battle and do whatever it takes to stop that suffering and oppression?
Yeah, I think
Mhm.
that's a big question.
Mm-hmm.
Would we see it, and would we be justified in doing something about it in Christ's name?
That gets interesting as well. Yeah. Yeah. And like Marsh said, we're living in this 21st century mindset, which is different than 100 years ago or 3,200 years ago. And so we can't kind of compare our kind of mindset or lifestyle expectation with this ancient people's needs and mindset. The reason I wanted to bring this up and kind of let you crunch it out in your head is because this is something that others might bring up as an argument against ever needing to read the Bible or follow the Bible or the Christian God or going to church or religion or faith or Christianity. So I want you to be thinking about those kinds of tough questions, because there might be someone who says, yeah, but what about this? What do you say to that? So I want you to be given good thought, so that if you're ever asked kind of that question by let's say an antagonistic skeptic or something, or maybe a very forceful atheist or something, and they say, well, what about this? What about this? There are valid questions to be raised about these tough passages. So we definitely need to give good time and think about them. And that's why I appreciate June's comments, Marcia's comments, Bill's comments about what was going on at the time then compared to now, that the Canaanites and their religion did represent, if we wanted to use sort of common parlance, a clear and present danger to the identity of the Israelite peoples. And it's those peoples that eventually are barely preserved in spite of themselves and their own bad decisions, because they kept giving in to these temptations. But the people and the covenant was barely preserved in spite of themselves, as a testament to God's faithfulness, so that eventually it does lead to Jesus and grace and resurrection. So as we continue looking through the Old Testament, remember these kind of warnings and that Deuteronomic code we talked about last week, and how important it is, because the Israelites are going to fail at it at almost every turn, or let's say every other turn, as we continue studying the Old Testament, and they really suffer bad consequences for it. As a concluding thought, with every Bible passage that we read and that we study, we should always ask the questions, what can these Bible verses teach me? How can they affect my life? So that's something else that makes these passages we've read tonight, the topics we've talked about, kind of difficult. What do we do with them? It's not obvious how we can apply them. Jesus' teachings and instructions were wonderfully clear, and there's no messing around. This is what he told us to do. Blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love the Lord your God. Those verses are pretty clear. So how can we personally read these and let them speak to us? So to help with that, as we end this discussion of tough questions tonight, let me turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 7, and let me read verses 6 through 7. And remember, Paul helped us know that Jesus' presence and sacrifice expanded the covenant to not just the Israelites, but to everyone who wants to be included. Okay, let's read Deuteronomy 7, 6 through 7. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous, or let's say stronger, powerful, than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. So, as we think about what a personal application there might be for us, aside from kind of the thorny, tricky issues, those verses were spoken to the Israelites at the time, but by grace, Jesus opened wide the doors of invitation so that all people might be called sons and daughters of God. So we get to be a holy and chosen people if we allow it. And those verses are things that we can apply to our lives, and thinking about what kind of temptations there are around us that might distract us from our mission and our Great Commission. What are ways that we might let ourselves be polluted by the world and other things? What do we need to do to help us stand more firm in our walk with Christ? Because there will always be obstacles in the way. So that's how I can take these passages and still find even a personal application, because I believe that every verse of the Bible should be read with the question, what can this teach me? And how can this help me? So take heart in being included in God's holy and chosen people. And remember, it's a hard world out there. And there's a lot of stuff that will distract you and pollute you from being your best self. So you have to be diligent, but remember that the Lord your God is with you. So let's pray, and we'll stop right there. Oh God, we confess that we will make bad decisions, that we will get distracted, that we will be tempted by any number of things, tempted by selfishness, tempted by laziness, tempted to indulge. So God, help us to hear your voice calling us to the way of your Christ. And it is a hard way to walk, but let us remember that you are walking with us. So therefore, nothing can hold us back. In your name we pray. Amen.